Welcome to the Faithful and True podcast. We're happy to come to you today with a very special guest. Jim Farm from the Faithful and True staff is joining us today. And Jim, we've been looking forward to your arrival all day long. We've been doing kind of a marathon recording session today, and Greg has hung in there like a trooper, and it's kind of led us to this point. This is an important podcast that's going to deal with stage one.
Yep, absolutely. So we are launching a series today where we're going to be doing 3 parts on the stages of growth for couples and understanding each of those stages. And so as Randy said, Jim and I are going to be talking about the first stage, and that is a time of chaos. And it's going to be talking about all that gets shattered and shifted in those early days where there has been new information, there's been some level of exposure, and all the chaos that creates. And then we're going to follow up with podcast stage 2. Susie's going to come and be with us, and we're going to be talking about a time to build and grow. And then finally, the third podcast is going to be on thriving, and my wife, Beth Miller, is going to join us for that. So we're kind of setting the stage for the next 3 podcasts, and we're very glad that you're here, Jim.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Yeah.
Did you guys ever have that experience in elementary school where, it was recess and you had the 2 captains and they picked teams? And you got chosen and you got chosen first. That's what it feels like today.
Absolutely. You should be celebrating
That's
that.
exactly the way we were looking at this too.
Well, one of the reasons we thought that it would be great for us to have a conversation is a lot of the work that we do is in the early days with couples when there's been an explosion, when there's been a lot of chaos. And it's almost as if they're trying to find their balance and their equilibrium again. So what we're going to be talking about is some of the things that we see couples do that help them find that balance. And the first thing that we're going to be talking about is demonstrating a commitment to sobriety. And obviously this is for the man. But one of the things that we know is if there's going to be hope for the coupleship, if there's going to be an ability to move forward, it's going to be important that the husband is incredibly committed to sobriety and willing to do the work necessary in order to sustain that. What are some of the ways, how do you talk to men about the importance of sobriety when they first show up in your office?
Yeah, early in recovery, it's a lot of confusion. Chaos has just happened. And so oftentimes, they're starting to become aware of things, for the first time and trying to shed, old beliefs. And so there's a lot of confusion. And so sometimes I'll kind of talk to them about, this concept of letting go or surrendering, which means basically I kind of have to stop trying to manage outcomes. Mm-hmm. And so I surrender to this process. And then the other thing I often talk about is, we start talking about the things that I must do rather than the things I should do. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? And so that gets them in this place of I'm willing to do whatever it takes to get to this place of sobriety. So there's things that we talk about, for example, early on is to start to develop a 3-circle plan, for example, which is kind of our model to begin, to develop sobriety in their life.
Absolutely. And one of the things that we acknowledge is that when our life is exploded, when there's been a lot of chaos, that can create a lot of desperation as a motivation to seek sobriety. And what I also know, though, in my own experience in working with men, is that at some point that desperation begins to fade. And if I don't have a desire for recovery and sobriety, once the desperation begins to fade, there's no other motivation, and I will fall back into the pattern of addiction and lose my sobriety. So I think it is helpful to understand that early chaos, if we steward it, can serve us in moving forward, but ultimately it's not going to be enough. And that helps us to understand the 3-circle plan, because part of the 3-circle plan is understanding what are those things in my life that I need to avoid that may pull me into acting out, and then what are the things in my life that are good, that are life-giving, that I need to include that will move me away from acting out. When you're talking to a guy about the things that may be in his life that may move him towards acting out in that yellow circle, what are some of the things that you're aware of that can be destructive for a man and weaken his commitment to sobriety.
Yeah, yeah. Well, let me talk first. First, one of the things I do initially is I help them to differentiate between, being clean and being sober. And so the 3-circle plan, if you can think about, this inner circle as being the red circle is the way we describe it, and that's really the things that we're trying to abstain from. And so just focusing on that just gets us to the place of being clean, but it really doesn't allow us to get sober, which is kind of that green circle that we talk about, the growth things that we're doing to grow our character and so forth. But the yellow circle in particular, the things that make us vulnerable, we talk about triggers, we which are, things that in the past have triggered us into into going to the red circle. Also, we talk about rituals and different emotional states that have made us vulnerable to going to the red circle. One of the things to be aware of in regards to the yellow circle is that, there's a neurochemical component to that our brain has associated those things in the past with the reward. I mean, when I say reward, not in such that the red circle is a good thing.
Yeah,
but,
not a positive reward.
But the dopamine,
Right.
right? It's the chemical release reward is what I'm talking about.
And I think just so that our listeners can understand, because you guys have so much knowledge and experience that this is just rolling off the tongue, but as the listener, if maybe for the first time is trying to imagine the 3 circles,
Yes.
yeah, what you're talking about is think of this target,
Yeah.
and the outer sector of it is green.
That's right.
The middle, the second one is yellow, and the core is bright red.
That's right.
Absolutely, yeah.
So it's
Yeah.
like the stop and go light, right? The red
Exactly.
is what we're trying to avoid.
Right, right. So I just wanted to give a visual to the listeners because you guys jump from which level of the circle to another. I wanted it to be easy. I think we did an earlier podcast in which Aaron featured that image
Right.
next to the podcast in case somebody goes back
Yeah.
into our archives and finds that.
Yeah. And I'm sorry.
Well, I was just going to say, the thing to understand about the trigger is, the way I describe it is a trigger is an external experience that creates an internal reaction. So it's something outside of me that then I have some sort of internal reaction to. And I've heard Deb talk about the fact that it's involuntary. It's not that we choose to be triggered. We just are triggered because, like you said, those old associations. And what we do with the trigger, how we steward it, is very, very important.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, and the other thing, about that is oftentimes when we talk about those yellow circle things, triggers and rituals, it's about, setting up boundaries around those things, which often I think for a lot of guys, that's a difficulty in itself because a lot of men we work with have come to believe boundaries are restrictive, and so when they hear boundaries, they're like, somebody's just going to tell me what I'm doing,
Yeah.
right? And so setting boundaries then almost puts them in this place of deprivation, which is a trigger by itself. And so one of the things that we're trying to teach guys is that boundaries is actually protective.
Right.
And so they start to have to recover that healthy concept of boundaries for themselves.
Yeah, the image that I use is growing up in our backyard, we had a fence. And so I could play freely in that backyard that was fenced off. And I was safe, especially when I was young, as long as I was in that backyard.
Yeah.
So the fence wasn't something that limited me. It was something that protected me. It kept what might be dangerous out and kept me and myself safe in the boundary or in the fence. And we like to help men understand that. So it isn't about limiting yourself in such a way that you're preventing something good from happening. It's actually creating a boundary where you can be safe, which creates the possibility of good things happening.
That's right.
And what's also true is the more we have lived our life without healthy boundaries, the more complex it is to begin to create them because it's an unlearned skill that eventually we have to learn how to do that for ourselves.
Yeah, yeah. And without those boundaries, we're left feeling helpless, And so it's really, teaching that. And then when we do say put a boundary up in place, it's, what's the yes that goes with that, which is really kind of the green circle stuff.
Right.
It's those healthy choices, where we can bring something in healthy as we put those, not restrictions, but put those safeguards up around our behaviors and triggers and so forth.
One of the ways I talk about addiction at the workshop is addiction is when we lose our yes and our no. The scripture says, let your yes be yes and your no be no. in a lot of ways that's interpreted to invite us to maybe be more opinionated or to be stubborn or to be entrenched in our thoughts. What I think actually we are being invited to is to find our yes to those things that bring us life and find our no to those things that rob us from life. And an addict has lost his yes or no so that he's saying yes to things that rob him of life and no to the things, like you said, the green circle that actually bring us life.
Yeah.
The other piece of this yellow circle that I think is important is acknowledging that it is the emotional triggers that are the strongest triggers.
Yeah.
And for those of us who are numb, for those of us who are disconnected from our emotions, those triggers are still operating whether we are aware of it or not. And so for a lot of men, they are carrying anxiety that they don't know how to acknowledge. It's there, but they are numb to that. But the anxiety that is unexpressed or unfelt is actually the trigger that moves them into the red circle and causes them to want to act out.
That's right. That's right. And that becomes, I think, as you get further in recovery, as they, get away from the coping mechanisms, those feelings start to resurface, stronger and stronger. And so if we don't have good, healthy options around those things, it just sets them up.
In fact, we tell men, one of the ways you can know your recovery is working is that those emotions that you've been avoiding or ignoring or denying are surfacing in a way that can be overwhelming at times, but are surfacing in a way that is free and natural versus controlled. That's a way that we can know that, hey, this work that I'm doing is making a difference because I'm letting myself feel all those things that in the past I've been avoiding.
That's right.
How do you talk to men about, because the way to lay it out is the red circle, the middle circle, or the center circle is what we want to avoid, and so that's about our sobriety. The middle circle is that yellow circle, those things that we need to avoid and get rid of so that we're not moved into the red circle. And then the green circle are those things that we need to bring into our life that bring us life. So what are some of the ways that you talk to men about that green circle?
Yeah, one of the things I do, and if you don't have access to this, I know in Mark's Life Guide book, one of the things I bring out is the daily inventory. And I'm not sure if you're familiar with that, but that's where Mark kind of separated life into 5 different areas: personal, relational, behavioral, and other areas. And he gave really good examples of what it would look like to be growing in those areas. And so those are things that I often talk about. I'll have guys take out that daily inventory and have them really start to look at, what are some of the experiences in that green circle. So for example, under the relational or emotional, making meaningful connection with someone every day would be an example under the relational aspect of the daily inventory.
Right. And even as something as simple as have the thought, what can bring me joy today? Even if it's a very simple thing.
Yeah.
One of the principles of recovery is if you're going to stop something, you need to start something. So as I'm moving the addiction energy out of my life, I need to be looking for those things that truly bring me life. Yeah. So is there something simple, that will bring me joy, that will maybe bring me laughter? And as you've identified, something that will help me to connect with someone else.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think one of the more important ones, I know you do online groups like I do, Greg. One of the things that a lot of the guys in my online groups do is what we call the practice of gratitude. As soon as they wake up in the morning, is one of the goals that we have is to identify 5 things we're thankful for, and they can just be small things. And the reason we talk about that so much is, a lot of this is about changing our neurochemistry, and we know with every thought we have this neurochemical reaction in our brain. So if we can get our thoughts already going to this place of gratitude, because I think most of us maybe years ago, the first thing we thought about when we woke up is, I got to do this today, I got to do that tomorrow, and we're flooded with cortisol,
right?
And so if we can get into that place of gratitude right away, that would be like an example of a green circle item.
And part of it is, it's not about denying reality. It's not about just focusing on the good things.
That's right.
Our day may be filled with things that are difficult and challenging. Yeah. So it's about embracing all of our day and choosing to start with things that we can be grateful for.
That's right.
Anytime somebody is trying to create a positive attitude by not focusing on all that is real, that's going to ultimately create chaos. Yeah. But it's just a choice of, I'm going to start with something that is good in my thoughts, knowing that my day may have other things that I have to face that may be difficult.
That's right. That's right. Yeah, it is, and part of that is teaching guys in this recovery plan is when I'm vulnerable, when I'm experiencing these emotions, rather than turning towards something, I'm turning towards someone. And so it's a big. I know one of the things we'll talk about is building community up, and I think that's a big part of this stage one is starting to build that support and community around ourselves.
And part of this for men is embracing who they are. We talk a lot about at the workshop that recovery isn't about just stopping a behavior, that recovery is the journey of becoming the man that God created you to be. And so whether you call it recovery or transformation or redemption or sanctification, this is the journey that we are on. So part of that is acknowledging what are the parts of me that I've not been allowing to flourish because of my addiction, and what are the things I'm interested in, what are the gifts that I have. A lot of times men kind of discover their creative part of them, that maybe it's about woodworking or music or painting or some other creative expression, but truly that green circle is about the fulfilling all of my parts, all that God has created me to be, and part of that is being creative.
Yeah, that's the exciting part of the work that we do is when, guys and the wives that we work with as well start to see that in themselves, start to discover that. That's really exciting.
And again, this sobriety piece is important because it helps to create a foundation of stability and hope in the coupleship. I've often heard Mark and Deb talk about if there's not sobriety, then it's really difficult to work with a couple because any of the couple's work simply becomes about the lack of sobriety.
That's right.
But once there's sustainable sobriety and that to some extent the wife is able to trust that, then it provides an opportunity for them as a couple to work on other issues.
Yeah. And I think that's why it's important too, Greg, at some point in recovery for a guy to actually share, what is my 3-circle plan with their spouse? Because we, as we share with guys, you cannot prove that you're not doing something. Right. But if she sees, hey, this is your plan, and sees those things in place, we start to rebuild trust.
Absolutely. And part of the dynamic is to share the 3-circle plan with your spouse and not make your spouse responsible for the 3-circle plan.
That's right.
And it's a very subtle shift where because of the lack of information or the lack of conversation, the wife can begin to believe that they are responsible for making sure that the 3-circle plan is being followed. And what we know is when the spouse begins to get into that parental role concerning the 3-circle plan, it limits their ability to be intimate. So if I have some sort of directional energy, if I feel like I'm responsible for somebody else, I'm not really able to be with them. And so we want the husband to share his 3-circle plan, but not make his wife responsible for implementing the plan. And you mentioned this, and it is about finding safe ways to communicate. And one of the tools that we use here is Phanos. And there's been podcasts on Phanos, but each of the letters stand for something. F stands for feelings, A for affirmation, N is for needs, O is for ownership, and the final S is sobriety. And it's the way that every day a husband can check in and allow his wife to know that he is sober. And a part of that is also talking about the things that he is doing to maintain sobriety. It's not just to check in of, hey, I'm sober, but it's, hey, this is what I'm learning about myself. This is the things I'm doing. I have this appointment with my therapist, or this is the thing I'm working on with my group. The nature of the group that I went to is each time you showed up with the thing that you needed to work on. And so what I loved about that is it made me responsible for my own journey. It made me responsible to be self-aware enough so that I could show up my group and say, hey, this is what I'm working on. And what's true is I also had the benefit of a community to speak truth to me, to even help me see some of those things, but I was responsible for naming them.
Yeah, very helpful, and especially the Phanos with couples. I think it helps spouses not to have to feel like I need to ask him if he's sober. It provides the opportunity for him to be able to initiate and offer that information freely.
Yeah, the one caveat to this is if the husband isn't sober, we would encourage him not to use Phanos as the way to share that information with his spouse. That if he loses his sobriety, that there's an independent conversation where he's able to share that information with her. Because without that, if he begins to use Phanos as the way to share if he's lost his sobriety, that's what Phanos becomes about. And that's not going to be helpful long term.
No, exactly.
Okay. So we're going to assume that he is working on sobriety, that he is committed to sobriety. And then that brings the next thing, and the language that we use is that you close the door for the relationship. And what we mean by that is there is a commitment to the relationship, and at least for a season, divorce is taken off the table. Now, what we know is early on there's so much chaos, there's so much pain, that there actually needs to be a season of being open to being able to get the information that we need. And in fact, I've often heard my wife Beth say to someone that in order to stay in the relationship, you have to know that leaving is possible. Because without that sense of leaving is possible, then you may stay, but you stay out of obligation. One of Beth's clients one time was told this idea that just because you stay doesn't mean you didn't leave. And just because I stay doesn't mean I haven't left the relationship in some way. So to be fully invested in the relationship, there may actually need to be a season where leaving is a possibility.
Yeah.
But what we also know for couples to begin to move forward, at some point there has to be a commitment to say, for at least the next 6 months or whatever it is, divorce is going to be taken off the table. I'm not going to threaten that. I'm committed to seeing if we can make this work.
Yeah, yeah. And oftentimes I'll remind couples is, in this recovery process, that doesn't mean, going back to the old marriage.
Right.
That if we choose to stay in this marriage, it's going to be a new kind of marriage.
Mm-hmm.
And so sometimes that's welcoming to be able to hear that.
Right.
I'm not staying in this marriage that I knew before. That if we move forward, it's going to be something that we're working on that's going to be more intimate and new.
Something better.
Something better.
Right.
Better.
Yeah.
And based on truth and honesty.
Yeah, we all look forward to things being better,
That's right.
and that's a real sign of hopefulness there.
What's complex is the something better is going to require work.
Yeah.
And that's why this commitment to staying in the relationship is so important, and closing the door to other options is, in the early days, it does get difficult. And if the door is always open to leave, every time it gets difficult, I may threaten the fact that I'm going to leave. Whereas it's kind of like remodeling a house. If you've ever remodeled a house, at some point, it becomes really difficult and very expensive. And so if you're not committed to the house, you could say, well, let's just leave and start over. That commitment to stay provides a sense of investment so that even when it gets difficult, and it will get difficult, I'm committed, I'm in, I want to figure this out. Now, after a certain amount of time, if there are things that aren't working, if there are continued struggles, then that separation, that divorce may be put back on the table. But at least for a season, it's off the table so that we can really see what is possible by our level of commitment.
That's right. That's right. It's such an emotional, stage, this first stage, that, making decisions like that so early sometimes become more of an emotional decision. And sometimes we just need more information, more awareness. And so being able to, I remember, I don't know how long ago it was when I was on the podcast with Mark, and I used the word patience. And he said, you just said the 4-lettered word of recovery.
Yes.
Do you remember this?
I do.
Right. And patience is incredibly difficult. And again, if there is this possibility of getting out just because it's hard, I'm going to have difficulty staying committed. And so if we can help couples understand it is going to take time, and if you give yourself some time, then you may discover the marriage that you desire. And like you said earlier, it's not about recreating the old structure, the old marriage. It's about having a vision of what is possible if we stay invested.
Yeah.
The next thing, and this will probably be the final thing that we're able to talk about, is the willingness to become educated about addiction and the root causes. And that's why, we spend time when men come to the men's workshop helping them to understand addiction, because without the education, what ends up happening is I simply believe that it's about my shame, that there's something wrong with me, and that's why I do this. Or without an education about addiction, I may try to simplify it and simply believe this is a behavior that I have to stop. So we know that men benefit from that education, but what we also see is that wives benefit from being educated about addiction too.
Yeah. Well, we have the saying around here, right? It's the problem's never the problem. I mean, the behavior is a problem, but it's not the
problem.
It is not the problem. And so it's the willingness to be able to, maybe discover, is there other things behind this, which we know there is.
And it also helps for there to be this understanding of these root causes. I often say, if somebody is offering you a simple solution to a complex issue, it's not going to be helpful. That there is a complexity to this. And if all we're trying to do is change our behavior, it's like mowing our lawn thinking we're going to get rid of the weeds. Yeah, you mow your lawn, it looks good for a little bit, but eventually the weeds will come back and bring their friends. The getting rid of them is about destroying and understanding the roots. And addiction is the same way. If I'm just trying to stop a behavior without digging into my story and figuring out what's causing and what's driving the addiction, then at some point I will fall back to it.
That's right. And I think it's an important thing in regards not only for a husband to figure out, what are some of the hows and whys of this addiction, but I think it's also very important for a wife to be able to hear that, because it allows her to have the information that he has an awareness of, what is it that, got me to this in the first place.
Well, and again, if as a man I don't understand what's driving the addiction, then I can't have confidence in my ability to be sober. But that's especially true for a wife. If the husband doesn't understand what's driving the addiction, it makes perfect sense. She's going to question, if you don't know why you've been doing this, how can I trust that you're not going to be doing it in the future? And again, we talk about this so much. Understanding the past is not for the purpose of blaming the past.
That's right.
Blame does not serve us. In fact, when we blame something or someone else, we are in some way releasing our responsibility and decreasing our ability to change it. And so we want men to understand the past, not to blame the past. And that's the same energy that we would want the wives to have also. This isn't about blaming and giving responsibility to something from my story, but it's simply understanding these factors came together, shaped and formed me in such a way that I begin to believe that some sort of sexual activity was going to meet a legitimate need. And we understand that it's an illegitimate way to meet the need, but that association begins some point. It's Mark's question of, when did sexual arousal become the solution to your problems? We want to help men begin to understand the answer to that.
Yeah, and oftentimes there's multiple reasons, and so that's why sometimes we start to develop the answer to that question over time, rather than it's just this moment.
Well, as we've said before, there's so much more that we can say about this phase one or this stage one. And we'll probably continue the conversation at some point. But thanks for being with us and being a part of the podcast today.
You are another step closer to being the newest YouTube sensation. we knew this was going to work out great. Thanks, Jim, so much for joining us on the podcast today. And for our listeners and now for our viewers, this is a new season for us at Faithful and True as we've entered the YouTube generation. We've got the new Faithful and True YouTube channel, easy for me to say, and we invite you to visit it, as well as listening to our audio podcast at faithfulandtrue.com and on iTunes and iHeartRadio. So Jim, thanks again. We look forward to having you back soon.
Yeah.
All right.
Thanks, Randy.
We hope that the coming week for all of you listeners and viewers is going to be a week that's just filled with many blessings and great vision.